Rubio.
Thanks for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman. The ranking member, thank you for being here. It's a complicated issue because it really involves two separate stories. The first is well, let me back up and say that, we have all, I say there's been a general consensus in American politics and American debate about the value of the global economic order, the rules-based trading system, and I do think, while this is a committee that focuses on foreign policy, that it is difficult to ignore that while free and open global trade has incredible benefits, it does have downsides. There are losers to trade, even agreements that are great, and not enough attention has been paid to the fact that people have been displaced over 20 or 30, 40 years, and that has created some of the domestic blowback against some of the trade. That said, by and large, America is generally a winner, particularly when we are interacting with countries who follow the rules, and that's where these dispute resolution mechanisms exist, and you have a hope that they would work when these countries also happen to be geopolitical allies with whom we partner with on a host of other issues, including national security. I think that wisdom would say that, particularly when we talk about the 232 actions, and whether it's our partners in the EU, Mexico, Canada, and other places, these are ultimately allies and countries that we do have issues that need to be addressed. But we can work with them. We believe we can, because ultimately none of these nations seek to displace the United States or undermine our position in the world. They do want to get better deals, but there's a mechanism in place to address it, which is why I would have strongly preferred for the President and the administration to kind of dealt with those issues second, after first focusing on China, because many of those countries that we are allies with have deep concerns about China as well, which leads us to the 301 actions. And the threat from China is perhaps without precedent. Senator Risch just mentioned a moment ago, Made in China 2025. That is a key piece of a broader plan to displace the United States on virtually every field that will define the 21st century. And if they were going to displace us because they work harder, because they're more innovative, because they're just out-hustle us, that's one thing. That just calls on us to work harder and do better. But the way they seek to displace us is through things like the theft of intellectual property. Just yesterday, or a couple days ago, a former employee of Apple was arrested at an airport in California, headed to China with a bunch of secrets and intellectual property on Apple's autonomous vehicle technology. Every single day brings stories. We've all heard the horror stories of the forced transfers. You want to do business in China? Here's your new partner. And by the way, you need to teach them everything you do so that in a few years, when they can do it as well as you can, we can kick you out and we can be your competitor backed by the Chinese government and put you out of business. Unfair practices of just outright denying market access, but demanding unfettered access to our own market. This needs to be addressed. And so there's a consensus, or there's a belief in the business community, well, we should have told China what we were upset about, we should have warned them, and this is what we're going to do if you don't listen. That's the story of the last 20 years. Our relationship with China economically over the last 20 years has been built on the hope that once they became richer, they would behave more like us. And what they've done is they've taken all the benefits of that global order, but assumed none of its responsibilities, leading us to this point. I guess my only question is, I wonder what role the State Department played, or others, in advising the administration on a path that would have said, why don't we partner with our allies first so we can all collectively confront China, because we are all facing the same challenges, and then secondarily deal with these other issues because of its geopolitical implications. And I would be remiss if I didn't also ask, related to that, what role, if any, did the State Department play in advising the administration on its recent decisions regarding ZTE? Because while I would say to you that the penalties imposed on ZTE for violating sanctions are severe for purposes of sanctions violation, they extend our issues with ZTE extend well beyond sanctions violations. Any telecommunication company in China is controlled by the Chinese government, whether they want to be or not, and allowing them to embed themselves in the commercial infrastructure of the United States poses a significant national security threat. And there is an irony that while we are out there imposing tariffs for national security on partner countries with whom we have national security arrangements with, we are allowing a foreign telecommunication operator to stay in business with our parts, knowing the threat they pose to our national security. So did the State Department have any role in advising from a geopolitical perspective and focusing on China first? And what role did the State Department play, if any, in the decision on ZTE?
Thank you, Senator, for those. Both of those are very important questions. The State Department has played and continues to play a role in advising the president on working with our allies to counter China. I previously indicated that in all of my travels, the senior leadership of the State Department, whether it's the Deputy Secretary, Secretary Pompeo himself, who, as you may know, is on a tour of several countries right now, we have explicitly provided input to the White House and said, we need to work with our allies specifically to counter China. We need their buy-in, because the only way to have success against China is to isolate them. China needs to be clear that it is a threat to the global economic community. And if our allies agree with us, then we can isolate China and force it to change its behavior. On your question regarding ZTE, the State Department did play a role, and we advocated the stiffest penalties possible against ZTE.
Mr. Chairman, I'd just like that. I think it's hard to partner up with countries to take on China and isolate China when we're in a trade war with the countries we seek to partner up with. So that's why I think this is something I hope we can get worked out.
I couldn't agree more. We've done a great job in unifying the world against us.
Thank you both for being here. Mr. Bolton, as I saw your written testimony, I want to sort of, the path forward that you outlined is one that I think by and large is a consensus, but there's one point that I would disagree with, and I wanted to detail it. Your plan, as I understand it, and many have argued as well, is number one, we need to detail the problems that we have with China, and you've accurately outlined them: the unfair restrictions on access and investment, the IP theft, the forced transfer of technology, subsidies to domestic production, and then restricting the digital trade, forcing them to have computing services facilities located within China, the requirement on Apple, for example, to place the cloud there and the like. The second part, so you've detailed those right. The second is giving them a deadline to change these things and telling them how we want to see those changes. And the third is, and here's a list of things we're going to do if you don't meet it by this deadline. The fourth is working with our allies, and in particular, I would imagine, Canada, Mexico, and the EU, which are 3 of our 4 largest export markets, by giving them an exemption from the 232 tariffs. And I would agree with all of those pieces, certainly 1 and 4. I agree with the things you've described and as the problems, and I would agree with the fact that we would be in a much stronger position if we were working with Canada, Mexico, and the EU. We just heard the testimony from the State Department that in every one of these meetings we raised the China issue. But I assure you, I'm confident that it's very difficult to get that message across when these other things are ongoing. The problem that I have is with giving them the deadline, and this is what we're going to do, and we're going to have a serious negotiation. Number one, the history of serious negotiations with China on matters such as this is not promising. By and large, they've shown a propensity to sort of try to get us to accept symbolic measures in exchange for nothing, really. I mean, in exchange for us walking away from whatever it is we're threatening to do. But here's the bigger problem, and that is that on 2 of these items, which are the ones the President's memorandum in March focused on, IP theft and in some ways forced technology transfer, I think there's an argument, a very strong argument to be made that what China's doing on that now is a clear and very serious national security threat to the United States. These are acts, in my opinion, of direct economic aggression, not simply for purposes of economic prosperity, but to displace the United States, supplant us in the world as a dominant power in many of these fields. And when you combine that with what they've outlined in China 2025, which interestingly they are now seeking to not talk about as much anymore, but it is most clearly the design they have in place. When you combine that with statements that have been made by President Xi about how there can only be 2 suns in the universe, and implying that there can only be one great power in the world, and it's going to be us. When you combine it with all these other factors, this is not just a conflict that we have here with a nation that simply seeks to have a bigger economy. They want to supplant us in all of these critical fields. I don't know if you see some of the technology that's being stolen and transferred, some of the stuff becomes irreversible. As an example, any gains they make in 5G technology, if they establish supremacy in 5G, which they're on the path to doing potentially, all of the technologies and industries of the 21st century dependent upon 5G will be built to Chinese standards, meaning we will now be out of place in regards to that, if they dominate biotechnology and the like. And so it seems like the biggest issue you have with the administration's approach on China is that we're not working with our allies under 232, which I agree, we would be stronger, but that they took the actions first as opposed to giving them a moment to. Is that an accurate assessment? I mean, your biggest complaint is we could do these things, but first we should have given serious negotiations a chance to work.
Yeah, that's roughly it. But I agree with everything you just said. And were I the negotiator, I would put at the top of the list exactly the issues you mentioned on intellectual property theft, technology transfer, and subsidies in critical industries. I would put those at the top of the list, and I would make clear what the consequences for the Chinese would be if they don't change their policies or practices. But I would also put on paper, here's what we want you to do. Here are the specific policies we want you to adopt. One thing that almost everybody that's in the business community that has interacted with the Chinese government, and I imagine members of this committee have had a similar experience, finds that when they talk to folks in the Chinese government says, well, what do you want? Tell us what you want. And waving our hands and saying, we want all of these problems fixed immediately, that's true, and that would be great, but we need to give the Chinese a coherent and practical list of the stuff we want them to do, put it on paper. You don't have to show it to those of us in the private sector. It's probably confidential. It ought to be shared with you so that you know what's on the priority list of the administration. It ought to be possible to write it down, and the administration ought to put that piece of paper on the table in front of the Chinese before they just jump off and announce huge retaliation.
Well, my last question, Mr. Chairman, because I'm out of time, is assuming they just refuse to do anything, would the list of things that we would threaten to do include the things that are being done now under the memorandum and the actions the President has taken?
They could. I mean, the 301 authority is an operation outside the rules of the WTO.
So is stealing intellectual property.
So is stealing intellectual property, and the WTO does not provide adequate protections for intellectual property, and we ought to pursue our rights under the WTO where we have them. WTO doesn't provide enough rights. So we in the Business Roundtable are not ruling out the possibility of the administration using authorities, its statutory authorities that are not sanctioned by the WTO, but they ought to be a last resort, not a first.